Hi, everyone. I'd like to invite you to another. This is not exactly a panel discussion, but we'll call it one. Just I got something to call it. What this hour is going to be about is the Colony High series, which is a series created by David Brin, who has written the first two books are written by David, and they are the first one's done. The second one, a little bit of work still to go on it. And Ring of Fire Press, we're very happy and proud that we'll be publishing the series for them. And we will be starting within a few months. And we wanted to use this opportunity to introduce people to the series, what it's about. I'm trying to think of a delicate way of saying why you should all go out and plan on buying it when it comes out, but there's really, no delicate way of saying it. Look, I'm an author. This is how we, pay the mortgage and put food on the table. I will say that, and I mean this quite honestly, it's a terrific story. I will also, being perfectly honest, admit that I would have probably published pretty much anything David put on my plate. But David, I have actually never read anything by David that I didn't like, quite honestly, some more than others, but there's a reason he has a reputation. He has a terrific writer. I first encountered David professionally, so to speak, when I was editing Jim Bain's Universe magazine, and David submitted a story he was starting to work on, which we started serializing in the magazine, and then the magazine sadly had to fold after 4 years. But David kept that story in his head, and years later he went back to it and he completed it. And if you got a copy, and David, I know you always have copies handy, there it is. And he will be doing a reading from that toward the very end of our hour tonight. Colony High is a terrific story, and it'll be a series. It's young adult, although it's sort of on the borderline of young adult and adult fiction. It can be easily read and enjoyed by adults. I read it and I enjoyed it, even reading it from the point of view of being an editor. So anyway, with no further ado, I will have our other two people here. Most of you will probably recognize the fellow he's at the top for me. The one who's sitting in front of a desk. Then there's the younger fellow who appears to be sitting in front of the Rocky Mountains. He's not, but that's the background I'm using. So if you two would introduce yourselves, David, we should probably start with you. David, your sound went off.
He's on mute.
I just muted because the phone rang and then I forgot. I'm going to have a very major birthday in about a little over a week. So one of those big milestones. So I'm practicing my senility. Let's see. But all you snowflakes who are complaining about 2020, yeah, it is a very rough year. And it's got no candle to hold against 1968. I'm just saying, any 2 weeks of 68.
Those of us who lived through it understand. Yeah.
Any 2 weeks of 68 would have killed any of you whippersnappers.
Yeah, I know.
So let's get on with it. I just finished a week of NASA meetings, so I still keep my hand in astrophysics and space science. I'm on the advisory council of NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concept program. And this is the first year in a whole bunch that I haven't spoken in DC to CIA or some of those agencies. They bring in hard science fiction authors to extrapolate possible things they hadn't thought of. But quite frankly, civilization seems to like me best as a sci-fi author. And so I really need to do that more. And I'm hoping to get back to the Uplift universe very soon, especially if all of you go out and vote and fix this civilization. So having said that, Colony High is a great old project that was loads of fun. And it was basically modeled after a Heinlein novel we all have among our favorites, Tunnel in the Sky. And that is, you take teenagers and you throw them into a Lord of the Flies situation and you see if maybe they might do a little bit better than Golding portrayed. And we now have scientific and historical evidence that on average, kids could probably do better than portray Lord of the Flies. So the notion is a simple elevator pitch, and it actually got some attention from Hollywood, and then we hope once it's published by wonderful Ring of Fire Press, that it will start reviving that interest. And the premise is basically aliens kidnap a California high school and live to regret it. I mean, that really pretty much sums it up. Let's just set a little bit of background here. It's an answer to E.T., the extraterrestrial. Now, mind you, I adore Spielberg. I think that he does not go for the simple idiot plot. And above all, he doesn't try to put his heroes in jeopardy by assuming that civilization is rotten and that America's rotten and that there's nothing you can do. Even in E.T., where they're afraid of the government, it turns out they find out that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. So I have got no beef with E.T. as a movie, but I wanted to start with the premise that there's a rumor going around 29 Palms High School out in the Mojave Desert that the math geeks have got themselves an alien in the basement of one of the houses. And our hero, who is, his dad is a widower, a major in the Marines, in the air wing at the nearby military base. He doubts this very much because California homes don't have basements. So anyway, they investigate, they find out that it's true. The jocks have taken over the alien. They're going to take him to Hollywood in order to gain status and they're killing him. And so Mark and his friends arrange for the alien to be rescued by NASA, but in front of cameras so it can't be kept secret. So it's the win-win situation, especially for the alien who gets to phone home using Goldstone radio. And the aliens arrive to pick him up and they say, we owe you a favor because you did this right. And some humans believe this was a test that they didn't think we would pass. In any event, the spaceship comes to deliver the gift that they've promised after picking up their emissary or their stranded lord. And they bypass the White House, they bypass New York. They're heading around the world and they're coming around again. And it seems that they're coming down towards California. And let's get started reading this. Is it just me, the younger boy mused, or does it look like that ship is slowing down a bit too much, Mark thought, as Barry felt silent, as they saw it approach 29 Palms. It's not on a direct course for the airbase. The airbase was where the creature had been first rescued and kept. In fact, the huge flying craft did not waver a bit left or right as it came straight at them. From this shortened distance, that meant the lander couldn't be heading for the contact center 5 miles to the north. It's coming here. Seconds later, that fact grew obvious to everyone as a door opened in the side of the great disk, vomiting a cloud of cylindrical drones that came swooping toward the town. This time, everyone knew about the Garubas style of landing, but it was one thing to watch on TV and quite another for the flurry of hollow tubes to hurtle toward you like a swarm of angry bees. People screamed, quite a few started to run, but the whirling cyclone of flying things now surrounded a few city blocks. It took more courage to approach the perimeter than to retreat inside the school. Even from a height of 1,000 feet, exhaust blasting down from the hovering lander felt uncomfortably hot. Only a hardy minority of students and staff remained outside to watch 3 spindly but massive legs rapidly take shape, self-assembling and climbing swiftly into the sky. One pillar slanted upward from just beyond the Food King's parking lot. A second crushed a hapless semi-trailer to bits next to the Shell station. The third spire set carnival dogs yelping madly as it grew upward from the athletic field. I guess, Barry stammered, I guess they're going to give the gift to us? Alexa finished the thought for him. Damn, it better be something cool. Speaking of cool, Mark admired how Alex was keeping hers. Then he caught her glancing up at him and realized she thinks the same about me. A completely different sound made him swivel as a theatrical vroom, a white van tore along Rimpaw Avenue, plunging through the swirl of alien drones, miraculously colliding with none of them. Barreling down the street, it pulled up amid squealing brakes before the high school. At first, Mark thought it might be science types from Sirocco Labs, but the vehicle bore an array of dishes and antennas on its roof. But no, out piled the reporter from Channel 6, Head Witness News, and her faithful tech cameraman. Up and down Rimpaw, he glimpsed similar migrants attempting to brave that cyclone of drone cylinders. Some students tried to flee the looming gift delivery, while other daring folks from town tried hard to get in. Local bikers weaved confidently inward, seeking the eye of the storm. But for most, there was no time to try or even decide. Barely more than a minute after it began, the tripod was finished self-assembling and the lander was settling quickly into place, at least 200 meters overhead. This is my answer to this, by the way, Brin here, this is my answer to the stupid cliche of hovering cylindrical ships. Ridiculous, but you can get the same effect by making a tripod. In fact, I think it's scarier.
I think it's really well done for what it's worth, but readers will have to find that when read that when they get the book.
Right. Oh, you know what? I bypassed introductions. I'll do that at the end of this chapter. The blast of warm air tapered off, then ceased, but not a low hum that seemed to vibrate his very innards. Now that the razor cloud of intimidating cylinder drones was gone, some more people moved. A few ran for the perimeter. Mark noticed Tom Spencer not hanging around to see what his reward might be for rescuing a stranded creature from the desert sands. Others hurried forward, scooting from the town, driven more by excitement than fear. Go or stay, he asked himself, as the vibration seems to intensify, plucking his bones like strings. Mark knew somehow that Alex and Barry would follow whatever he chose to do. Decide now. Okay, point of view shift, but first, let me introduce you. I guys all met Alexei before, but Steve Ruskin, a talented young author who's going to be helping to shepherd this series along. He's got a couple of publication credits that are noteworthy and seems to have a lot of talent. Now, let me point out that book one I wrote entirely myself. Book two was drafted according to my outline by the late Jeff Carlson, who I then had to do a fair amount of work to tidy it up because he died before leaving two young sons. He died before he was able to tidy up his draft. So that's what book two is going to be. Book three, Steve and I are working on an outline and he's going to dive into it there. So Steve, we'll get a chance to hear from you in a minute, but I think people want some momentum on this story.
Yeah,
Great.
Okay, chapter 11, Parental Notification. These all have infernally clever titles having to do with school. Rushing from the white dome of the contact center, Dr. Karen Polanders-Bear flashed her credentials and commandeered a place aboard one of the helicopters rising from the nearby airstrip. Voices yammered frantic questions in her ear via secure link to other members of her team assembled in New York, where they had expected the aliens to come to the UN. I don't know anything yet, she shouted as the chopper pilot set blades spinning. The tripod stands just south of here, right over the town. No, we haven't heard a peep from the lander. Has there been anything from the mothership? Nothing at all. Lifting off the copter soon gave her a better perspective. The alien tower platform had seemed impressive last Saturday, standing beside Manhattan's skyscrapers when it picked up their lost emissary. Now, above the open desert, it resembled a mountain, a stool for gods, a giant fork stuck into the earth. Air Force planes and news copters buzzing nearby only struck home the scale of the thing. They were mosquitoes, less than mosquitoes. Oh, dear Lord, she murmured as they gained enough altitude to look down at an angle upon the little city of 29 Palms. It's standing right over my daughter's school. The helicopter pitched and bucked. Keep it still, one of Karen's associates demanded, trying to aim instruments at the spacecraft. It was doing something, manipulating mighty forces. The detector device in her lap told her that much before every dial went redline, reached its max, or simply burned out. Something screwing the electronics, the pilot snapped. Karen noticed several cockpit meters twitching to the same rhythm of static she heard in her headset, a rhythm that seemed to penetrate her skin. Despite the noise, New York kept hurling frantic questions. I don't know, she repeated, but I think something's about to happen. More frenzied queries rattled her ears, but she could only answer with a low cry as the Garubus lander shuddered, causing the tripod to tremble visibly. It changed color before her eyes, sliding along the spectrum from reddish toward yellow, green, and finally intense blue. Then, from the vessel's rim, there fell a curtain of dazzling light, dripping slowly as if liquid. In terrified dismay, Karen saw the radiant cone broaden, catching two nearby earthling craft in its hem, melting their rotors and tossing them like gnats, sending them a tumble toward the Mojave dunes. Then the curtain tightened inward, narrowing to fit snugly within the trio of legs. It was hard to peer at the fierce illumination, which seemed to solidify somehow into a bubble of palpable brilliance. A jolt shook the chopper. The pilot struggled with his throttle to full, throwing his throttle to full and climbing even as a shockwave visible as ripple in the air. Oh, there needs to be an article there, visible as a ripple in the air. Caught up and plowed into them. Roaring, dazzling brilliance heaved around her. Karen held on for dear life as the helicopter dipped, rattled, and shook. Alarms wailed. The control panel erupted with red lights. Technicians protected precious instruments with their bodies. For a minute, it seemed all was lost. Next stop, the hard earth. Then, abruptly, the sensation of powerful energies simply vanished. In seconds, the air calmed, releasing her pilot to sob in relief, and Karen's head was out the door, turning and peering frantically. The first thing she saw was a pillar of smoke rising from flaming wreckage. An aircraft, probably one of the experimental fighter planes, lay in crumpled heap at one end of a city street, with a trail of torn autos in its wake. That was awful enough, but she wasted no time turning the other way to find a pall of sparkling dust hanging over the part of town near Olympic and Rimpaw, obscuring everything underneath. Out of this fog, the last few bits and flying components of the landing tripod could be seen rushing skyward, joining their fellows in the belly of the giant hovering disc. Soon they were all recovered and the big hatch closed. The great vessel began climbing away. What happened? What happened? What happened? For a moment, Karen could not tell where the question came from. It was an almost simultaneous shout, a chant emitted from her headphones, from everyone in the chopper, and from her own dazzled mind. Then, as the alien vessel started moving, an amplified voice took over the radio waves. Thus, repayment is accomplished. With this gift, the debt is erased. Where the tripod had been just minutes before, a stiffening breeze now tugged at the dust cloud, unraveling it, along with every shred of hope Karen had been vainly clutching. For under the clearing haze, she now saw that the whole area now lay empty, worse than empty. The high school and several city blocks were gone. Just a crater remained, circular, smooth-sided, and uniformly several meters deep. A quiet, crystal clarity settled upon Karen's senses. Over headphones, she heard someone in authority shout a protest that was immediately translated into Garubus chatter-gabble as it chased after the fast departing vessel. "You ugly alien bastards, you call this a gift?" The answer came almost immediately. "It is more than adequate, chosen from the wish list for ambitious upstarts. Now we can wipe our feet clean of your dross. When next we meet, it will be without a burden of debt, on our terms." Earth's spokesman retorted in anger, speaking for a shocked human race. "This meeting isn't over, you sons of bitches. Nobody disintegrates our kids and gets away with it." Glittering reflections off metal, angry jets converging, racing, kicked in their afterburners to catch up with the fast receding alien craft, but Karen saw it was hopeless. All the fighter planes could do was launch a few missiles that streaked vengefully after the Garuba's disk, then fell away as the vessel accelerated blithely, indifferently towards space. Karen had already dismissed the idea of revenge, at least for now. Tomorrow there would be work to do, analyzing what weapon had done this thing and beginning the hard process of arming humankind for life in a hostile universe. A cosmos where the rules of debt and honor were apparently far weirder than any earthling had formerly imagined. One where slaying 1,000 adolescents was repayment for an act of kindness and hospitality. For now, though, all she could do is stare at the steaming crater, its smooth floor now stained with liquids pouring from severed utility pipes, water, gasoline, sewage. Soon sparks from a broken electric line set the puddles ablaze. Karen felt certain that she could put out the flames with her tears. Okie dokie.
All right.
I could go on and show the scene of what happened next from the point of view of Alex and his friends, but any Heinlein reader would be able to fill in the general notion. So why don't we leave that as a teaser? And even though we gave you a hint of what's going to happen toward the end of part one, I don't think that that is going to spoil the tension for any of you out there.
No, it won't. And I remember when I read it and when I got to that point, and I realized what you're doing, I actually laughed because I've used that same, what would you call it, trope, gimmick, several times in my own writing of, just grab a bunch of people and haul them off somewhere and put them.
Oh, no, where?
Yeah. I've done it in my first novel, 1632. But what I was mostly thinking of was when I got to not there, but at the next few chapters, I thought, well, okay, this is sort of a tunnel in the sky. Sort of, it really isn't, especially becomes clear as you get further into the story. By the way, for those of you out there who've never read it, Tunnel in the Sky is one of Robert Heinlein's all-time great young adult novels.
You won't notice that it's young adult. It's a great story.
Well, the difference is that Tunnel in the Sky is a straight, simple. It's really a very simple adventure. These youngsters are transplanted to a alien planet as basically it's an examination, a test for them to see if they've learned enough from the course they've taken in survival skills. And then something goes wrong, and instead of being recalled in a few days, they wind up stranded there. But that's the setting and that's the story. And the background to Colony High is a lot more complex than that. And one thing, Heinlein's story doesn't have inimical aliens in it. And
you'll meet some more aliens.
yeah, I know. And this series, well, this is a series. This is the beginning of the series. It's not one novel the way Heinlein's was. And it will be going on for some time. There's a fascinating world David's created, or fascinating universe, I should say, and there are many, many possibilities to explore. Mark, Sorry, I'm thinking of the hero of the book. Steve,
Yeah.
give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, sure. Well, I am also a Ring of Fire author, fairly new. My sort of supernatural thriller, The Newton Cipher, is well, it just came out not even 2 months ago, and I think it's been doing pretty well. I'm really pleased about the way it's gone with Ring of Fire Press. So, so yes, I've written some fiction, sort of science fiction. I guess you would call that maybe more fantasy. I've also got some science fiction short novels out on my own, as well as a series of short stories, which is kind of how I started. I've been writing fiction for, I don't know, Eric, how long have I known you? 6 years since I first met you at Superstar, something like that.
That's
So,
where we met,
yeah,
right? At
yeah.
Superstars, yeah. Remind me, but you were, well, no, you couldn't have been in my seminar because we didn't launch it until 3-4 years ago. Yeah, it would have been around then.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm saying, but I've written nonfiction as a historian for almost 20 years. I mean, other things too, but my deeper background, I guess you could say, is I have a PhD in history of science. So I've written nonfiction for many years, but of course, like any red-blooded American boy, I grew up, in 70s and 80s reading kind of all the greats, as well as some of the newer stuff in the science fiction genre. So, I sort of invariably found my way, to writing fiction because I've always loved reading it. And like I said, I met you and some others like Kevin J. Anderson, and Rebecca, his wife, and Dean Wesley Smith, and Chris Rush, and just sort of fell in love with writing science fiction and fantasy, and was pleased to eventually sort of find a home, at least with some of my stuff, with you at Ring of Fire.
It's what happened. I have told people many times that the reason to go to, well, back in the days when you could do it, where for the moment at least having to do all this virtually, which makes it in some ways easier, but also trickier. The real reason to go to a science fiction convention is really, if you're a writer trying to become a writer, it's really not to promote your works, because I'll be honest with you, if you figure out the mathematics cold-bloodedly, you're going to spend more money than you could possibly make, no matter where you are in your career. But what you will do over time is build a professional network. And it's impossible to predict where and how that network will pay off for you, but I have never known it not to, sooner or later, somehow or other. And it's always different, and it's usually quite unpredictable. What happened in my case, in my career, was I wrote my first novel. Jim Bain published it, and then he did what Jim had done a number of times, was he hooked me up with an established experienced writer. In my case, it was David Drake, and I spent the next 2 years of my life just working with David on a series. It was the Belisari series, which we worked on together. And I think of that as my apprenticeship. It was just a wonderful way to learn, to learn more of the skill and get more experience. And the other thing too is that it shelters you to a great deal, because you've got an experienced author's name is connected with yours, and that's going to buffer you from what almost invariably happens to unknown authors. Is it's really rough to get noticed and to get any kind of sales. And it's a tradition that I like, and David likes it also. And so when he and I started talking about the Colony High project, and the possibility of Ring of Fire Press publishing it, he asked me, do you have anybody that, we could bring in and could start working with me on? And I said, yeah, I do. And I raised it with Steve, and that's how this got rolling. David, how did you come up with where did the story originate for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm a big believer in the community of mind. I sometimes have dissident voices inside myself, and I utilize them in order to generate characters. I utilize them in order to argue with myself about this and that. And when I first started writing The Postman, it was after reading a post-apocalyptic wanderer story in Analog. And I thought, what would I do next? To try to develop some ability to get fed, even. And, in such a world, you would lie. You might still have ethics and not hurt people, but your ethics toward lying to survive would go away fast. And so that developed into the postman. In this case, well, I don't really remember, since I first wrote the first original novella to Colony High and pitched it around Hollywood, gosh, sometime in the mid 90s, even early 90s. Disney for a while acted as if they were excited about it, but they wanted to partner me with some young comic writers, and they wanted Porky's in space. In other words, all kids would think of if they were in that situation is no parental influence, no laws, we'll just party on. And that's not what young people are truly interested in, or they'd get over it real quick. What they really want, what they hunger for, they used to be given at age 15, 16, is to be taken seriously. And back in Roman times, male or female, you were taken seriously at 15, 16. And here we tell them, you're going to have to live as long as you have already lived before we take you seriously. This kind of involuntary adventure is the sort of thing that lets you do that, because that's what happens to happen to a lot of 15, 16-year-olds. They've involuntarily had to grow up fast. And I think that sort of story is intriguing.
Yeah, I think that's what's so exciting about Colony High. You're right. I mean, I guess it doesn't surprise me to think that in the mid 90s, someone was trying to do Porky's in space or whatever, because I think that takes a pretty, typical but dim view of, the teenage psyche. I mean, sure, there's a lot of hormones at that age, but there's a lot more going on, and we've all been through that. We were trying to figure out who we were, and so yeah, I think you handle Colony High with a much more sensitive touch in that respect. It does come out really well. These are kids who, of course, they're interested in boys and girls and each other and sports and just goofing around, but they want to be taken seriously. And, they show that, what Mark and Alex do in the initial part, as you've already mentioned, trying to free their little Xeno alien and get him out of the clutches of a bunch of, jocks who want to just make money off him, shows some responsibility, and some humanity.
Yeah, well, there was a briefly run TV series called The Society that I strongly suspect was a ripoff by some of the people who heard the Colony High pitch. It didn't last long, and it was not anything that I think particularly deserved to last long. But there were some of the people who were on the series. Of course, one gets used to that. I could name some other examples, but you just forge ahead. So where did you get your history of science degree, Steve?
Well, I was actually at the University of Notre Dame, so which was fine. I like Notre Dame. I'm not Catholic. Eric said that I'm not actually in front of the Rocky Mountains, which is true in one sense, although if I looked straight ahead through the walls of my house, I do live in Colorado, so I am staring at Pikes Peak. So I just use that background because my office right now looks kind of like a mini version of David's with the bookshelves. But unfortunately, my office is full of junk because we've been working on our basement and there's a lot of stuff. So I'm using this virtual background.
Well, it's interesting. You're redoing the floor of our sunroom.
Yeah, it's a pain. So, and my office keeps things out of the way. So it's all kind of stuff back here.
But at least you have a basement.
Oh, I do, yes. I live in Colorado.
And I'm pissed off.
I am in my basement. This is where my writing office.
It's not even counted on your real estate tax.
No, it's not. It's not. And
It's
this
not.
is officially a 1,200 square foot house, but it's almost It's
I-
almost twice that size.
I just have a
Because
slant.
I've got this basement finished. It's completely functional all the way through it. And including, I actually built an extension under the porch where they've got a big library in there. Anyway, by the way, I don't know if it didn't get much coverage, but there actually was an incident that happened in real life that was very much like Lord of the Flies. A group of kids, and they were quite young, around 10 years old, all boys, got marooned on an island somewhere. The kids were Indonesian.
Tonga.
Huh?
It was near Tonga, in the
Yeah.
Tongan archipelago.
That's right.
And they created
Right.
very prim rules for
Yeah.
how
It was the exact opposite of Lord of the Flies. They did everything that Golding, opposite of what Golding said kids
and
would
that
do.
doesn't necessarily mean that pompous upper class
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah.
English so-called public school kids wouldn't behave the way Golding described.
That's true. That's true.
So it may be a cultural thing, but
Not all kids are the same. No, that's definitely.
it is not inevitable for human beings.
Yeah. Anyway,
So
David, do you want to? Well, we still got a little bit of time. Because you want to do a reading from ancient ones also. Why don't we just go for another 5 minutes, and then you'll have time to do the reading. And of course, naturally, now I'm blanking on the next thing I was going to ask you. What I remember, huh?
How do you like my fake background?
I want to work in that office.
The pixelation is primo.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And this right here is Mars, and this this is Venus, and this is the cover for Sundiver that Jim Burns gave me.
Yeah.
It all fits right around this.
Right.
All right, go on, please, Eric.
I tried doing a virtual background. I never got one to work right. This here is supposed to be the green screen, but I guess it's the wrong shade of green. So I finally said, "Oh, to hell with it," and I just put up a poster. Otherwise, what is actually behind here, when I'm not doing virtual stuff, is covered with. It's a bulletin board, and it's covered with papers. Damn it, there's a working office. Anyway, one of the things I found fascinating, and readers will learn more about this as the series unfolds, and I'm not going to tell you because A, I know you undoubtedly hate spoilers, and B, I undoubtedly want to keep teasing people so they'll keep being interested in the series. But you've developed a fascinating alien background to me. The basic premise you sort of have developed is, I wouldn't call it exactly unique, but it's a different twist on the Fermi Paradox than I've heard before. It's going to make a hell of a good background for the series as it unfolds, I think.
Thank you. I had one of the very first papers about the Fermi Paradox in 1983 in the Royal Astronomical Society. I called it the Great Silence then because nobody had given it the Fermi Paradox moniker then, and I still think my name for it is a lot better. But
What did you call it?
The Great Silence.
Oh, okay.
Silence.
All right.
But yeah, well, thank you very much, Eric. I hope that this will be a premise that people will find intriguing and interesting. And above all, I'm hoping that Steve will find it interesting. So
I already do. So
alrighty then. Well, as we're both very busy right now, but when you feel ready, you can double the length of that outline, and I'll poke at it and double it again, and that should bring us close.
Cool. Sounds great.
We will be coming out with the first book in the series, which is titled Sky Horizon. We'll be publishing that in January.
Oh,
And-
but just for the sake of really prim collectors, there was a specialty press edition of Sky Horizon, the novella, the shorter version, from Subterranean Press in a very limited hardcover, back, I think, before the turn of the century. But that's merely, it has nothing to do with this one, because this Sky Horizon is more than twice as long. And there were only a few hundred copies made. But for collectors.
All right, David, why don't you do the readings from Ancient Ones, because I don't want to run out of time. So, and by the way, I bought this story from David, and it is a terrific story. There's a reason why I wanted to publish it. And I didn't publish the whole thing. We just published the beginning of it. And I meant to ask David, and I forgot to do it. Couple 3 years later, after we closed, I said, did you ever get going with that story? And I was delighted at the discovery he had.
Well, we just self-published it recently, because my normal publishers are terrified of comedy.
Oh, I did.
Maybe Eric and I should talk.
Yeah.
Because,
I don't think there's much that terrifies Eric.
No, there's not much that terrifies Eric.
No, there's well, I have, in fairness, I have an advantage. What anchors my publishing house is a 1632 series, because basically every book we put out in the 1632 series, and so far we've published 28, and 24 of them are already making money, and 3 of them are going to within a year. There's one sort of run of the litter that may not, but I'm not worried about it because it'll cover its costs eventually. But one of the things that enables me to do, which most small presses just can't, is I can afford to pretty much do what I want. And so the basic rule is, if either I or my editors like a book or a project, we'll do it. And it's a lot of fun, I can tell you that. It would probably, any good corporate bean counter who heard me explain my business philosophy would probably turn pale.
Except it's the basis for the whole Maxwell Perkins era of the greatest era of publishing. And that is, I like this.
Yeah. No, we could have a whole panel on this, but entitled "What Publishers Don't Understand About Publishing," and we would have to turn away our fellow co-authors, many of whom are friends of ours and old pros, and would have plenty to say on the subject. But in any event, I am really looking forward to this project. Part of the reason, of course, is David and I have known each other for a very long time. And I've been a fan of his writing for, when did Star Tide Rising come out? 82, 84, when was it?
It was, I think, 82 or 83.
Yeah, that's when I first encountered you as a Star Tide.
1984 Worldcon was mine.
That's where you got the Hugo, and it won the Nebula same year, didn't it?
Yeah. And may you once in your life, Steve, especially you, may you once in your life have a year in which you attend all the gatherings of your craft and hear it's him. It didn't last long. It doesn't last long.
I know.
For about 8 or 9 months, I would go to conventions and hear that phrase following.
You were you were the golden boy. I never went to science fiction conventions. I always knew about them, but it was just not.
Oh, I'm the same here. That was maybe my 3rd or 4th convention.
Yeah. I never actually went to any until I was already an author, and I went as an author, not as a fan. But I've loved David's work for almost 40 years now, and then I discovered, completely to my surprise, that David had started reading the 1632 series. I ran into you personally, I think it was in San Diego at Condor, if I recall correctly. That's where I ran into you. And anyway, we have stayed in touch ever since. And I'm delighted to be publishing, David. It's a different relationship, and I really like working with David.
Well, I like being easy to work with. So that's this, because what I got from Poul Anderson, among many things, the greatest single storyteller I ever knew. Not so much the greatest author, not so much the greatest fiction guy, that would be Frederick Pohl, but the greatest storyteller. It was that there are times when the story is master and you have to give it the devotion you would give to your country. Even if you don't like where it's going, if it has to go there, then you must obey. You must be loyal to the story. But let's see if we can get in just one little chapter here of the Ancient One.
Please do.
Basically the Ancient One, when you try to do humor, you have to pick a couple of types of humor. You can lace them together, but you can't have it be a pastiche of every kind. And so while there are a lot of puns in this book, it takes itself seriously in the Poul Anderson sense, in the sense that the story has to make sense in its context. You can't just hurl exaggerations here. It has to work in its context. Now, this is a context that's insane. Basically, I took Star Trek. I mean, John Scalzi did Red Shirts. I had started this already before I ever heard of Red Shirts. You take a Star Trek situation, the Grand Federation of Worlds or whatever, and humans are the ancient ones. We've gone out there. We taught everyone else Starflight because that fits with the Fermi Paradox. And they think we're the great ancient ones because we discovered this 60 years before them. And we run into this species called the Demis, who are everything we would rather be. They're the ones who get to be hypersexed, lucky, impulsive, brilliant, puckish, everything about Kirk that infuriated the Vulcans. Only this protagonist is just a mature human. He's not hyperlogical Vulcan. This is not a humans as Vulcans. We just have to deal with the fact that we're not the ones who are destined to have all the fun. And so as a result, he has a lot of fun. Okay, let's start the excerpt. So, you've decided to come down here slumming, almost finished with your academy training and raring to go hit the old galaxy, squeezing it for adventure. And you heard about a senior class tradition. Head down to a spaceport bar where retired characters hang out with implausible stories to tell. Things never taught to human cadets, not in formal class, that is. Did they also tell you academy administrators don't approve that you may get docked pay or pick up a demerit from old gas bag? Or that Professor Admiral Bloodsucker might come do something even more painful to your tender human necks if she catches you down here? Don't care? Well, what a daring lot of eager lasses and lads. And you bought the first of several rounds, so? All right, you're paying, I'll drink and tell. And if you snicker at my professorial tone, well, I was a lecturer up there on the hill for many years. Not that you shave-tails are in any position to judge. So just shut up and listen while this old brain calls up those ancient tracks. Only a few humans qualify for this job, you students, the elite of our rates, may Yahtzee pity us, are being trained for a difficult and dangerous task vital to the survival of our world and many others. For those finally chosen to serve, the demands will be heavy and unending. First, above all other requirements, you have to like demis. I mean, really like them. Try to imagine spending a voyage of several years crammed in tight quarters with over 200 of those brash, rambunctious, impulsive, affectionate, abrasive, maddening creatures, sharing constant peril while daily enduring their puckish, brilliant, idiotic, mercurial, and always astonishing natures. It would drive any normal man or woman to gibbering distraction. Against such pressures, the human advisor aboard a demi-ship must always display the legendary earthling traits of calmness, reason, and restraint. Plus, heaven help us, genuine affection for the impossible creatures. At times, this fondness may be your only hope. Everyone knows that love and hate are cousins, and so while I remain loyal even now to my demi-captain and crewmates, there were days when some infuriating antic left me frazzled to the bones. Times when I found that I could fathom the very different attitude chosen by our Spartan foes, who wished to roast every demi slowly over a neutron star. They love nicknames, the demis. They call us the Ancient Ones because they learned flight from us 58 years after we developed it. That's how much longer we roamed the star lanes, 58 years. And for this, they deferentially call us the Ancient Ones. Sure, why not? But you came down here to patronize an old man pretending to learn from his experience, so keep my glass full. And don't snicker when I slip into present tense. The memories are that strong. Let me tell you about a time our good ship, Clever Gamble, entered orbit above a planet of the system Oxytocin 41. I was at my science station performing routine scans when Captain Ohm inquired about the signs of intelligent life. There is a Technic civilization, I explained. And I'll dip a little into chapter 2. There is a Technic civilization, Captain. Scanners reveal a sophisticated network of roads, moderate electromagnetic activity indicative of... Never mind the details, Dr. Montessori, our commander interrupted, leaping out of his slouch chair, bounding over to my station. At 5.5 feet tall, he was tall for a demi. Still, I made certain to stoop a little, giving him the best light. Are they over 16 on the Turgenev scale? He asked urgently. Can we make contact? Contact. I rubbed my chin, a human mannerism that our crew expected from their earthling advisor. I would say so, Captain, though to be precise, great, let's go down then. I tried entreating, what's the hurry? Why not spend a day or two collecting data? It never hurts to know what we're stepping into. The captain grinned, belying his human likeness by exposing twin rows of brilliant pointy teeth. That's okay, advisor, I've had slippery boots before, never stopped me yet. The crude witticism triggered laughter from other demis in the command center. They often find my expressions of caution amusing, even when I later prove right. So let's see now. I don't think we have time for me to take them to the slurry room. You see, Star Trek beaming down is impossible by quantum mechanics. You cannot know where every proton and electron is in a human body and then send it down to the planet. But the cells in your body are macroscopic. And so, in theory, you could step into a liquescing room and the universal solvent comes in and dissolves your body into constituent labeled cells, which then slurry down a giant hose. That's what the disk in front of a demi starship is. It's carrying one giant hose around the galaxy that they insert down behind some bushes in a park. And the, shall we say, process of stepping into the slurry room and being dissolved and coursing down a tube, down a hose, down to a planet to have your cells all restacked meticulously is something that humans would not have chosen. But demis get their way. He does wonder when he's seeing his hand reconstruct, wasn't this mole on the back of the captain's neck? Yeah, and I could tell you also about the blasters that they have that shoot nanos and the only kind of stun gun that could ever possibly work. It, you know, you have all these tune your blaster to stun and it knocks out all the aliens. No, there's one kind of blaster that would take down and immobilize every single alien you shot it at. And I describe that in this book.
Awesome.
Listen, we live in a universe where Star Wars has established that in the future they have ray guns that shoot slower than bullets. Only enough that they, and I'm sitting there. My father was a big game hunter. I grew up around rifles, and it's like, no, you're not going to deflect the bullet of a 30-06. Trust me. I don't care if you're Obi-Wan Kenobi. You can't even see the goddamn thing.
Their argument is that that the Jedi sort of predict the future.
Yeah, I know. Look, it's fun to watch. It's
one of the best covers I ever had was for a nonfiction book, Star Wars on Trial.
Uh-huh.
I was the prosecuting attorney and called witnesses, because this is for the Smart Pop series of Ben Bella books, which is a great thing because they turn things around on Hollywood. So if there's a piece of pop culture, they do a guerrilla raid and make an inexpensive book of intellectual essays about the pop culture, and they make money off parasiting on Hollywood instead of the other way around.
Perfectly legal.
Yeah.
They're protected.
And there's some good stuff in those series.
Yeah, well, I was in 7 seasons of Buffy, and I edited the King Kong one. But the point is that the Star Wars on Trial, one of his novelizers was the defense attorney, so he called witnesses on these charges against Star Wars. But we couldn't use any Lucasian characters on the cover because they're copyrighted.
Good.
So there, with a sort of nondescript, generic robot judge and a bunch of aliens in the jury box, they're in the witness stand wearing a plaid shirt and looking kind of angry is George freaking Lucas. Because he's not copyrighted. And behind him, the shadow on the wall is a Darth Vader helmet with 2 giant black circles, dark circles. Because, of course, Disney now owns the whole schmear.
Yeah, it's.
I remember that.
No, it's Lucas is too famous to be able to claim invasion of privacy because it's like if you run for office, well, you sort of forfeit, because you chose to make yourself publicly visible.
If you're lied, you still have recourse if you're lied about.
Yeah. Oh no, that's a separate issue. That's a separate issue. It's not even that. For instance, I can write a novel in which I refer to Jeff Bezos in the course of the novel, just because he's the richest man in the world. I'm sorry, he has sort of in that sense forfeited his right to privacy. But if I were to write a novel in which I put my next door neighbor without his agreement and permission, then he could in fact sue me because I have hauled him out from, obscure private life of his own.
That is one example of where our society has chosen to weigh the scales of justice in favor of the little guy.
Right.
We tend to ignore how many of these there are. And this whole anti-government cult out there doesn't pay any attention to how our parents in the greatest generation, they set up a lot of these things in order for us to have more equality and freedom, not in order to oppress.
Yeah, no,
so that's a little bit of a implicit rant for you guys to all go out and vote. Steve, did you have any final remarks?
Well, all I want to say is I am absolutely thrilled to be joining you on Colony High. We've just sort of started on this project. I've been reading through all the materials. It's going to be awesome. Really excited. I appreciate Eric getting me involved. I appreciate your willingness to have me involved, David, and I'm just looking forward to it.
All right.
An awful lot can be conveyed with
Yeah.
him.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, someone who will not be named is kind of a bit poisoned the well of the thumbs up. But I won't. Let's not go there.
Oh.
Anyhow, thank you both for coming, and thank you those of you watching for having watched this. And keep an eye out. I strongly urge you to make sure you keep subscribed. Well, you don't actually have to subscribe. Just don't unsubscribe, because you can unsubscribe anytime you want, but just don't. And you'll keep getting our newsletter once a week, and that newsletter will, trust me, let you know when we're getting ready to have the first book of Colony High come out. It will be in January. The title is Sky Horizon, and I do not have a cover for it yet, but we will have one shortly. Well, couple months.
And meanwhile, I'm sure that down at the bottom of this link will be a link.
Yes. And get David's The Ancient One. And really do. It's a great story.
Yeah.
And if the sales of the self-published do well, I'll talk to Eric.
All right, sure.
All right.
All right.
Great.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.